I'm Kevin.
I'm Julia.
I'm Sammy.
I'm Katie.
I'm Brandon.
Today we'll be talking to you about proxemics.
Proxemics is the interrelated observations and theories of humans' use of space as specialized elaboration of culture.
We'll be discussing the different types of space and how they affect our communication,
as well as how culture, age, and gender can affect our use of space.
Intimate space is a space measured from 0 to 18 inches. It is space reserved for people with whom we are very close to, like significant others or even family members. We can see this in our everyday life, like in the classroom. For example, you can tell with friends who are close to each other, they'll be close and whispering in each other's ears, while friends who are just acquaintances will be sitting farther apart.
Next, we are going to talk about personal space. Personal space ranges from 18 inches to about 4 feet. We share our personal space with our friends and people whom we necessarily like. Personal space expands or contracts based on variables such as gender, personality, relationship, and the situation at hand. Personal space can also serve as a body buffer zone that can protect us from the intrusion of those who we do not want to enter our personal space. Research has also demonstrated that we react to personal space psychologically as well as physiologically. One study done in the 1960s on monkeys observed that the amygdala in the brain deals with personal space and how we react when people invade, but was proved hard to test in humans. Scientists have also determined that the maintenance of personal space appears to be a very basic human survival mechanism. We observe personal space in our everyday routines. For example, how we interact with our friends or our roommates, to how close we let people walking next to us on the street get to us.
Social space ranges from 4 to 10 feet and is also sometimes called the business zone. This space is used for our business associates and people that we feel little or no interpersonal relationship with. One example of social space is people interacting in an office space. You can see that everyone is fairly reserved and keeping to themselves, but there is some inclination that these people are familiar with each other. Different examples of social space are also working on a group project, like most of us were at the beginning of this semester, as well as sitting in a conference room.
And finally, we have public distance. This is the furthest distance in the outermost bubble of proxemics. This space is usually observed in cases of public speaking in a setting such as this, or observing people from a far enough distance where interpersonal interactions are limited. We can see this on our own campus when we see two people who sit on far enough sides of the bench in order to distance themselves from each other. While public space offers much more freedom than other zones in proxemics, there are still rules that guide our social behaviors in these public spaces. For example, we might avoid certain streets because they are designated as rough areas, or how parks will post signs limiting the time we can use these public spaces, even though they're public.
Anthropologists have divided cultures into two broad groups, contact and non-contact cultures. By definition, non-contact cultures have only very limited personal contact. For instance, in Australia, excessive physical contact is considered rude and should be avoided where possible. Like their British ancestors, Australians prefer to keep physical contact to a formal minimum to maintain a bigger space between each other in conversation. After initially shaking hands, it is common for two people to make any more physical contact. Things like hugs, kisses, or holding hands are considered highly intimate forms of affection and are limited to only very close friends and relations. However, unlike some other non-contact cultures, Australians are unlikely to become offended by different cultural norms. Used to overseas travels, Australians are highly adaptive to new and different cultures and customs, and are more likely than other non-contact cultures to take different customs in their stride.
Contact cultures are cultural groups that may stand closer to one another when talking and use touch much more frequently. Examples of these are cultures in South America, Southern Europe, and the Middle East. Examples of these differences can be seen in greetings. For instance, in many Latin American communities, it is common to greet a family member, a friend, or even a stranger with a kiss on the cheek. This greeting is high contact because it breaks our touch barrier. While seen in normal, standard greetings in the Latin American communities, it is very rare in the United States and other non-contact cultures, and could likely cause someone to feel uncomfortable because of this breach in intimate space.
However, it's important to remember that while culture has a huge influence on how a person uses space in conversation, you can never make cut and dry assessments based on culture. As in most things, individual preference beats out cultural norms. Just because someone is from a certain culture does not mean that they necessarily prescribe to that culture's proxemic norms. As always, get to know someone and their preferences before making judgments.
Attempting to make judgments based on race, it is important to remember that it is one of the least important factors that affect proxemics. Culture, sex, and age are all far more influential on how a person uses proxemics in conversation than race is, and should always be considered before making assumptions based on race. However, one More important than any other factor is the individual themselves. Like the culture, just because someone is of a certain race does not mean that they will use proxemics in a way typical of that race. It's very likely that a person will have their own rules about spatial norms and comfort zones based on their own preferences, rather than based on racial norms. When getting to know someone's spatial norms and comfort zones, you should always interact directly with that person and always avoid making generalizations based on race.
One of the most significant factors that affects the use of space in conversation is gender. As a rule, men tend to prefer much greater distance when interacting with others. They also tend to prefer to take up much greater space with their bodies, like this. On the other hand, females correspondingly prefer a closer and more intimate distance when communicating and will usually take up less space overall, like this.
Both genders also respond differently to space invaders. As a rule, men are more willing to allow someone to come closer to their front, while women prefer to allow people closest to their sides. However, both genders are far more likely to accept a space invader when they find that person physically attractive.
Influences are,
Greater areas with their bodies, like this. Bodies, like this. On the other, much greater areas with their bodies, like this. On the other hand, females correspond.
Sammy.
You're right.